no. And he said, well, let's do it now. And within an hour, she passed all of the things that she needed to do to fly that plane. And so the next morning, she flew that plane out to California. Betty Gillies was the second experienced female pilot recruited for Nancy Love's program. She got her pilot's license in 1929. Now, she was only 5 feet 1.5 inches, so she had wooden blocks made so her feet could reach the pedals in some of these planes. She was a squadron leader for the second in command under Nancy Love. She actually survived Pearl Harbor. She was an instructor there. And she died in 1998 at the age of 90. A lot of these women lived into their 90s or even older. Teresa James, another original. She was the first woman assigned a long-distance solo flight. In 1950, she was commissioned as a major in the Air Force Reserve. Her uniform is in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. And she died at the age of 94 in 2008. Here's a picture of Teresa and Betty Gillies at the Modification Center in Evansville. So they were frequent, they made frequent stops here in Evansville. There was actually an apartment in Evansville that the women would stay in if they had to spend the night before they took a P-47. At one point, I don't remember the exact date, but there were about 250 planes sitting around Republic Aviation that had to be flown out. And they finally brought in a large group of pilots to start flying them out one by one. Cornelia Fort. She was the first pilot to encounter the Japanese Air Force at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. She was the second member of the group of Nancy Love's original pilots. She was the first female in history to die on active duty in March of 43 at the age of 24. The crash was caused by a male pilot flying too close. You might recognize this particular pilot, Joanne Josie Wallace Orr. She was the wife of one of our governors. She was the daughter of the Wallace family who owned a chain of department stores. She joined the WASP and eventually became a squadron commander. She was discharged like all the rest of them in December 44. She married Robert Orr, who was governor from 81 to 89. She passed away at the age of 85 in 2006. Helen Ritchie, this one's an interesting one. She was an experienced pilot. So a lot of records as a pilot before World War II. She was the first woman to be hired by a commercial airline. Back then it was called Central, it's now called United. But she had to quit her job because the male pilots refused to fly with her. She was a co-pilot with Amelia Earhart in the Bendix Trophy race of 1934. She was the last female pilot to fly a P-47 out of Evansville in 1944. She committed suicide in 1947. Shirley Slade. She was stationed at 3 different air bases, Dallas, Kansas, and Texas, Harlan in Texas. She flew Bell B-39 Air Cobras, and Martin B-26 Marauders. And that's her on the cover of Life magazine in July of 1943, where they had an article about the WASPs being trained in Sweetwater. Jean Landis. Look at her birth date and then look at when she passed. She was 104 when she passed a year and a half ago. She had a bachelor's in physical education in 1940 from San Diego, a master's from Wellesley. She got her pilot's license in 41 as part of the civilian pilot training program. She was the only female in that class. She said the P-51 Mustang was her favorite plane, and in her final flight, she flew it around the Statue of Liberty and wept in reflection of what she had accomplished in the past couple of years. Ah Ying Li. She joined the Chinese Flying Club of Portland and was one of the first Chinese American women to get a pilot's license in 1932, but she had to go to China to get it. She tried to join the Chinese Air Force in 1933, but she was denied. And in November 44, the plane she was flying collided with another one due to confusion at the control tower. She was pulled from the wreckage, and her flight jacket was still smoldering from the crash, and she died 2 days later. There were African-American female pilots before and during and after World War II, but they were not allowed to fly as part of the WASP program. Bessie Coleman was the first African-American and Native Indian to get a pilot's license in 21. She wasn't allowed to train in the United States, so she learned to speak French and went to flight school in France. She died in a plane crash at the age of 34. Willa Brown became the first African-American woman to get her pilot's license in the United States in 1938. They actually made a movie based on the WASPs. It was based on a book called Looking for Trouble that was published in 1941. And it was loosely tied into the Nancy Love's first group of original women. Loretta Young had the role of Nancy Love. Now it's very hard to get this film. I've been trying for a couple of years, and last night, I've been looking on Amazon, and last night I got to thinking, maybe it's on eBay or ETSY, and sure enough I found it, so I ordered it. But it did have a record loss back at the time, probably because the general public couldn't accept the fact that there were women pilots. It took 30 years before these women were granted status as military veterans. And they were not allowed to be buried at Arlington Cemetery until 2015, and only their ashes could be buried because they were running out of space at the cemetery at the time, and so full coffins were no longer allowed. They received a Congressional Medal of Honor in 2009 in a Senate bill signed by President Barack Obama. It was to all the pilots. The award is the Congress's highest expression of national appreciation for distinguished achievement and contributions by individuals or institutions. The area where they were trained in Sweetwater, Texas, is now a museum dedicated to these women. So it's the women's, it's the National WASP World War II Museum. One of these days I'm going to make it down there. But it's out in the middle of flippin' nowhere, 40 miles east of Abilene, and it takes forever just to get to Abilene. Then you have to get in a car or fly a small plane to get to Abilene. To get to Sweetwater. Now this is a quote by one of these women, Lieutenant Colonel Marjorie Gray, who retired from the U.S. Air Force in '77. The proudest moment of my life wasn't when I graduated from college, soloed in my first plane, obtained my commercial rating, received the Air Force Meritorious Service Award or the Lady Hay Trophy. None of these. It was when I received my silver wing as a graduate of the first class of women to receive military cadet flight training. I was one of 23 of 28 classmates to complete this training. After graduation from the first class of WASP at Ellington Field in '43, she was stationed at Newcastle Air Force Base in Wilmington, Delaware, under the command of Betty Gillies. And that's just a list of some of the planes that she flew. Now here's another quote from Annelle Henderson Bulacek. You don't need legislation to prove something. You can be whatever you set your heart and head to be. Don't let anyone tell you you can't be, because 1,078 women pilots did it in World War II. These women would go on to inspire generations of women to follow them. Women were finally allowed to fly in the Air Force about 30 years later. And these are just some of those women who count the WASPs as their mentors. Any questions?
Are you a pilot?
No. No.
Well, you never know.
No. Well, we have some Warbird planes that come into the museum every year as part of fundraisers, and this year it's going to be a B-25 and a
Avenger.
Avenger. And occasionally, when they don't fill the plane up, they'll come to the volunteers and say, "Would you like to get on?" And of course, the guys are yeah, and then at one point, and then they'll turn to me and say, "Donna, you want to go?" No. I'm sorry, but these planes are 80 freaking years old, and I'm not trusting my life up there. Who knows what can happen? But anyway, if one of you would like to get on them, you can reserve a spot. They're selling the tickets already online. That's September 28th and 29th, so there's plenty of time. And then in August, we have a Huey helicopter, a Vietnam Huey helicopter that's completely restored, that's also coming back, and we'll be doing rides at the museum on August 10th and 11th. And keep in mind, we have a 1943 Sherman tank at the museum, and on the first and third Saturdays of the months May through October, we sell rides in the tank. So it's $100 a ride. You just go to our website to reserve a spot. Yesterday was our first time we did it this year. And we have to be very careful because we use, you know where our museum is. Right next to it is this kind of a field with a big hill of dirt on it. And they use that field to drive the tank around. And the guy who runs the program for me, because it's part of my events committee, he calls it a 64,000 pound Cuisinart. It will destroy everything in its path. Well, we've had a little bit of rain lately, and so they were going to cancel yesterday's tank rides, but they reached out to the airport, and they came up with a deal, and the airport allowed us to run that tank yesterday on one of their back roads. I don't know where or which one, and then they're going to test and see if it did any damage to that runway. So I haven't heard back from the guys yet to find out whether or not it did any actual damage. Yes?
I saw Nancy Love passed away in 1976, and that was the same year that the United States Air Force started letting women in. Was that a correlation or just coincidental?
I don't think it was 76.
I thought it was 73.
Because
I think so. There is two dates there because I was
Yeah.
wondering the same thing.
yeah, something's wrong there. Well, although Jackie Cochran died in 1980. And I just looked that up, so I know 76 is right. But she wasn't part of the Army Air Force, so she must have passed before they allowed women in.
Yeah, I didn't know if, like, her passing away led to demonstrations.
Oh,
or
that I don't know.
legislation, or-
There have been, they've been pushing for years until they were finally, the bill was finally passed. But yeah, it took a lot of effort for that to happen. Anyone else? All right, thank you.
As you can see and heard, women were not treated very nicely by wanting to get in and do what the men did. They joined the service to help keep our country clear and to help fight the enemies, and they got no respect.
Something similar actually happened in World War I. They needed some women to run the switchboards in France. Now, up until then, men ran the switchboards, but they did a study and found that women were more proficient at moving calls through at a faster pace. So they said, well, we're going to have the women, bring in some women to do it. And they wanted them to speak French, but not all of them actually did. So they took 200 women, sent them out to the front in France to run as switchboards. Now, they took the military oath and they were given uniforms. They didn't find out until the end of the war that they were never considered part of the military, so there were no benefits, nothing. And some of them lost their lives too.
There's only one. I went on the honor flight in October, and of all of the monuments and that having to do with the military and the wars, there's only one monument that was dedicated to the women. That's right inside Arlington Park, or Arlington Cemetery, and there was a. They gave us a piece of paper to to write down what our suggestions would be, and that was the thing that I addressed on mine. That I felt like one monument dedicated to the women that helped in the war was way too few, and they needed to get more of that out there in Washington, in the Washington area to at least, so when they go, when the ladies go there, they can know that the ladies were at least acknowledged more than just one little monument.
We have a friend whose daughter graduated from Purdue about 4 years ago in aviation. She's now working for a commercial airline on the West Coast, but she needed 1,000 hours of, in the air before she could be hired for a commercial line. And she was going on about how difficult that is to get. 1,000 hours is a lot.
That's why most flight instructors are young kids, is because
Yes.
they're just the building, the time.
That's exactly
so
what
they
she
can move
did.
on commercially.
That's right, yeah.
Donna, I want to thank you for a very fine presentation, and we appreciate you taking out your busy schedule. I know you do a lot out there, and if you haven't been, of course, right now it's shut down because of the. Did you say what? Tell them what happened.
Well, did you all hear we got hit by it was called a super burst, I think, super burst. They tore the roof off of the hangar, and it rained in, and the wind came in and just blew everything around in the hangar, made a big mess. So there's a temporary fix on the roof, and one of the hangar doors got blown in. There was a 5/4 ton Vietnam military truck just inside those hangar doors, and that door blew in, shoved that truck into the P-47 and did some damage to the runner on one of the wings of the P-47. Now we're told that if that truck hadn't been there, that door could have slammed all the way into the P-47 and done even more damage. Believe it or not, wasn't a scratch on the tank.
Imagine that.
Like I said, yeah, Cousinart. But anyway, so and there's a temporary fix on the door, and the airport owns the hangar, so they're responsible. It's their insurance, and then they're responsible for getting contracts out there with somebody to come in and actually do permanent. So we're sort of targeting July, maybe mid-July to reopen.
Is that Alan's plane out there? Sanderson's.
Well, he flew a P-47, not that P-47. Yeah.
Alan Sanderson was a very decorated pilot in
P-47
the
pilot.
war, P-47 pilot. I worked with him in American General. Well, actually, it was Credit Thrift. I worked with him all those years 29 years I worked there. Well, I didn't work, he retired before that. But I did not find out anything about his background in the military until after he passed away. That's how he was about keeping a low profile on what he did, and
Yeah.
he just didn't want to brag about it or anything.
Now, I met Alan 8 years ago, right after I retired, and he and I would go to the high schools in the area and talk about Evansville during World War II, and when we got to Republic, I would talk about the factory, and all of that. He would talk about the plane itself and what it was like to fly the plane. And once you got him, when you would sit down and start talking about World War II and the P-47 or what it was like to fly, he would talk.
Yeah.
He would talk. One of his favorite stories, or one of our favorite stories, was he was on a mission with the other pilots in his squadron flying, or he was stationed at Corsica on an island west of Italy. And they would fly a lot of missions in Italy and Africa and places like that. They were going over a city in Italy, a small city in Italy, when there was a German shooting at them next to a building, at the bottom of a building. And he radios over to the other pilots and says, I believe I can get this guy. And one of the other guys radioed back and said, Sandy, don't believe I'd do that. That's the Leaning Tower of Pisa. So thanks to Alan Sanderson, that Leaning Tower is still leaning in the city of Pisa. Now, a couple days later, they're on another mission, and they're going through Pisa. Another German down there shooting up at him, and this time he shoots a hole in the wing, in one of the wings of Alan's plane, and it knocks out the steering, and he could only fly in one direction. So he made 360-degree turns all the way back to Corsica. And when he would tell this story to the high school kids, they would say, well, why didn't you jump? And he goes, well, number one, that water looked awfully cold. Number two, he didn't want to lose his plane. And believe it or not, this plane was very hard to take out. That engine was air-cooled, 18 cylinders. Unlike a liquid-cooled engine, if you blow a hole in the radiator, it overheats and goes nowhere. But Alan said they could blow 5-6 cylinders and this plane would still fly. And like I said, even the Germans admitted it was tough to take down a P-47 from the air. But he did. He made it back to base. And we even have a video of him standing on the wing back in 1942 or 3. It was actually on a film that was done about pilots.
The War Department video.
Yeah, War Department video, yeah. But yeah, it was very interesting to listen to him talk about it. He passed away at the age of 99, early 2022.
A fine gentleman he was. You never heard a harsh word out of him. Or...
When he turned 99 in November of 2023, his wish was to get in the P-47. Now, if any of you have seen the P-47, it's not hard to get in. I mean, it's very hard to get in. I don't even think I could do it. It's just, when you get to our age, you're not as flexible as you were when these guys were flying these planes. And so they rented a cherry picker and got him up into the plane. And one of our last photos is of him on this plane.
Anybody else got anything or any more questions? Ms. Bone, we thank you very much for taking your time out.
Thank you.
And if you would you give... next week is our 4th series, and it's